got her statue now by Ellen Tyson, the same artist, because this is a copy of that, is now at the entrance of 2 libraries. Now, if you go to my webpage there, storiesbysteve.com, you'll find, you can read this PDF, you can download it, and there are a bunch of others there on Opal Whiteley and history in general. I usually put at the very end thanking people for their help. But I decided to put it up at the beginning to make sure I got to everybody. There's so many people, so if you don't see your name there, I'm real sorry. I'll get to it. Especially want to thank my wife, Karen, 37 years. June 20th, this coming week, is our 37th anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we're going to spend it at the Village Green, the place where we spent our first night. And, and you know, there's a lot of people that have helped me along the way, and that I wouldn't be, you know, standing here in front of you, for better or worse today, without their help. And many of them are listed here. And here's other folks that have really helped us. This is mine and Karen's wedding certificate in 1982, signed by Dick and Laura Secord. And Laura Secord's here today, but certainly without Dick and Laura, we probably wouldn't have. They were really big encouragers in our marriage. In our early years on 3rd Street in Cottage Grove, we were really poor. I mean, and Dick kept her car running, and Laura helped with the babysitting and everything else. So I just wanted to start with that little acknowledgement. And also, the very first thing is, I am not an expert on gold mining. I'm not really an expert on the Bohemia mining district. However, I think that everybody will acknowledge I am an expert on colorful characters. So what makes a colorful character? And if you think about it, and we just saw this movie last night on Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, and he had some of these characteristics. They tend to be real visionaries. They also tend to be loners and hard workers. They're adventurers. They take risks. They're almost always stubborn. And they're always smart. And they may not have a PhD, but if you were on the island Survivor, you would want them rather than and Bohemia Sharp, picture of him when he's 75, he really fits this description. But the first one we're going to start with is Dr. Oglesby. Now this, I hope y'all can see the type. If you go online, you know, you can find it and download it in the PDF of my website. This guy should be a statue too. Listen to some of the things he did. He was a gold miner, he was a medical doctor. In his middle 40s, he was involved he led the last Indian fight against Native American tribes in Oregon. And then he becomes, in his later years, a friend of the Kalapuya Indians down here and documents their language and history. He had a horse ranch of like 600 horses in Fossil, Oregon, in the latter part of the 1800s. And Opal Whiteley's family, Opal Whiteley's mother spent part of her girlhood on that horse ranch with 600 horses. He was mayor of 2 towns. He was mayor of Junction City, and he was mayor of Limitai, briefly, because Limitai didn't last long. And just a few of the highlights of his life. He is the man he's with the first white men to find gold in what's now called Sharp's Creek. There's several others up there. Now, several of those fellows, I think one man named Adams, and I can't remember the other 2 men, they go to Southern Oregon to learn gold mining techniques. Oglesby goes off, becomes a medical doctor. He later on performs this historic cancer surgery, ovarian cancer on a woman. And when he's 44 years old in 1878, he leads these teenage boys in the Battle of Willow Springs. That was the last significant conflict with Native American tribes in Oregon. And in 1890, Oglesby and Henry Pearson, who was Opal Whiteley's uncle, and without Pearson, person, we don't have the Opal Whiteley we think of. They make the discovery of the antimine, and that changes everything because that really proves there's a lot of real good lode rock up there. And let's see, here's a picture of them. Oh, the museum provided a lot of these photographs, so I really appreciate that. Here's a photograph of Oglesby and his mother and his wife and his daughter, and who was a newspaper woman and actually went to New Orleans in 1900, representing Cottage Grove in newspapers. And he was the city public health officer from 1903 to 1917. He built the first city water supply up on Mount David. And so this guy was incredible. In 1871 there, he starts selling, when he's a doctor, he starts selling the healing balm of Gilead. And the most wonderful healing agents ever discovered, everything they heal. What's it? See, here he's got references, people who say yes, it works. Now, July 1878, that's when he's in the Battle of Willow Springs. He gets shot in the knee, and that was a collection of tribes in northeast Oregon. And he was 44 years old, a medical doctor with not very much military experience, but he was a heck of a tough pioneer guy. He committed 55 teenage boys. Now, there are two accounts of it. There were like 1,000 bloodthirsty redskins, both original reports, versus 55 teenage boys. Or one account says 6,000. Those numbers are probably really vastly inflated. But this article here in 1917 was very active in seeking pensions for veterans of the Indian Wars. But later, when he's in Cottage Grove, he becomes a real friend to the Kalapuya Indians. He saves the life of Chief Halo, and he's also, I don't have a copy of it, but he also gave an interview to an anthropologist from a college in California, where he documents for the first time that the Kalapuya spoke multiple dialects, not just one language. And then he's also really active in Oregon, preserving Oregon history. This is when he finds the Washerwoman mine, love that name, with Curran in 1900. And that's Oglesby here on the left. So even though he was a practicing doctor and rode his horse to all the points, though he's a practicing doctor, he never quit mining for gold. And here he is. He turns 81 years old. He's still 1917. He's still active, I found this. The great thing about looking up historical newspapers, and you can find them all the old historical newspapers online now. Just go to search for Oregon historical newspapers, and then you'll be presented with almost all of the old newspapers around the state. You find some of the most interesting, when you're searching for one thing, you find the most interesting articles if you look at another corner of the page. And up next to the article about Dr. Oglesby is this article about a Dr. Alan Hart from Albany, Oregon, who becomes the first trans man to have a surgery, a sex change operation in New York. He was a medical doctor, and he went on to do a lot of research in that. You never know what you're going to run into in newspapers, but it's interesting that things like this are documented. He also wrote poetry, and he wrote this poem about Elbert Bede. He wrote it anonymously, and Elbert Bede thought that Oglesby had written it, and Oglesby's daughter had written in her family biography that one of the things her dad did was write poetry. He was also very active with the Sentinel. When they publish an article about the history of the area, he's one of the people that they would consult. And so because of him, most of the explanations from where we get like Silk Creek, the Cerro Gordo, Row River, Sharps Creek. Those are actually recollections of Oglesby that the center printed and then were carried forward. But what's really interesting here is that in this 1917 article, it says that Sharps Creek, and this makes a lot of sense, was originally called Oglesby Creek, because that's the creek where they first found, where Oglesby and his friends first found a little color, just enough to really get them excited. And Bryce Creek that we know of today, Bryce Creek, it's originally Brass Creek, B-R-A-S-S, named for Brass Creek, an early miner up there. And how it changes over time, who knows, but it does. And I found Frank Brass's name in numerous local articles, but never Bryce. So that happened sometime, maybe after the 20s, probably after the mining district had ebbs and flows where it would get very active and then drop off. And chances are when it was in one of the drop off periods, and that name, people weren't around to change it. Anyway, in 1920, Dr. Oglesby died, and this is a wonderful obituary. Also talked about him being a master mason, and that he also had a fight with the outlaw Black Bart. Now, if 100 years ago, if I had said the name Black Bart, everybody in the room would just kind of shiver, like, he was the bad guy of Northern California and the West. And he had a fight with him, and Bart was armed and Oglesby wasn't, so Oglesby didn't win the fight, but he tried. Now, this is a PDF document. Here's 3 pages of references on Dr. Oglesby that you can just click on and go to. Oh, he's in the Pioneer Centennial History of Oregon. He did so many interesting things, and depending on how you search for a name, here's what you find when you look for Dr. period Oglesby. But if I'd said Doc Oglesby or Doctor spelled out Oglesby or W.W. Oglesby, you might get different results. But he was also instrumental in bringing the railroad, the OP&E Railroad, that went up to Regina. Here's an interesting historical thing. This is not him, but it may be his family. In 1888, the Albany Democrat has this article calling this Drunken Dick Oglesby. Dick Oglesby, I looked up, he was a minister. He had a prayer day for Lincoln. Now this is 1888, after Lincoln's been after he's been assassinated. But this writer just goes on and on about memorials for Lincoln and what a terrible man President Lincoln was. And it's just really interesting to see that just so, in print. But this is 1888. And he was also the military surgeon of the Grand Army of the Republic, Cottage Grove. And let's see, the Golden Slipper Mine, he's in that. He's in a lot of mines up there. And you can find these obituaries there in the file. So that's what I have about Dr. Oglesby. I mean, there should practically be a statue or at least, a little monument or something around the hospitals or something. That man was just a giant. And I've heard the expression Renaissance man. And interesting enough, while many miners have the reputation of being rough and just, ignorant, they really aren't. You find a lot of really smart and educated people, whether they're educated in schools like this man was, or whether they're self-educated like others were. So this next part of the talk, I really like, because I got this question: where's the body of Bohemia Sharp? And it should be quietly resting out in Fir Grove Cemetery in the Pioneer section. But let me tell you a little bit about this man, Bohemia Sharp. Opal Whiteley wanted to write a story about him, a novel, calling it The Impossible Man. And she even pitched this to the Atlantic Monthly. If they had chosen to print this story rather than her diary, who knows how literary history would have been changed. But by her term, the word, when she calls it the impossible man, because impossible to deal with. And he was from a wealthy family, and that family invented the Sharp's rifle that, you know, during the Civil War sold so many. So he was the child of privilege for his time. And he was a college graduate in civil engineering. And he actually knew, and I found this hard to believe when I saw it in an article, so I did some background checking, and I believe it's true. He did know General Grant, he did know General McClellan, he did know John Wilkes Booth. And he knew all of these men in St. Louis, because each one of them spent considerable time in St. Louis. And Sharp is from a wealthy family. He's educated. Yes, he goes to the theater and sees and meets John Wilkes Booth. Yeah, he has contact with these other men who become famous Civil War generals. Now, however, rather than becoming a Civil War hero, it'd be nice to say he was a Civil War hero and then came to Oregon. What really happened, in his own words, is that for weeks he and this militia had been practicing, had been marching with their guns, and people were getting real excited. The Civil War was just about to happen. And he apparently loved the marching, because he describes it in his memories as it was just really a fun time. The ladies came out and threw flowers to you, and you felt like you were part of Julius Caesar's legions, is what he said. But Missouri being a split state, when the Civil War started, they marched Sharp's platoon or company out of town, told them to lay down their rifles, disband, and then they went their own way, most of them enlisting in the Union or the Southern side. Except Bohemia Sharp did not do that. James Sharp there, because he had not heard of Bohemia yet. James Sharp, he takes off for, guess where? He takes off for Panama, and this particular little town in the interior of Panama. And it's, no, not Panama, Peru, excuse me. But he's coming through the Isthmus of Panama, and he meets people who are coming up to Oregon, and they convince him to come to Oregon instead of going on to Peru. So instead of joining the Civil War, Bohemia Sharp heads off to Peru, about as far away as you can get. He actually was the first postmaster at Cottage Grove. He builds the first road up to Bohemia, but he never got paid for it. That was to haunt his life. He was known for wearing mostly long johns, and the stage went right by his house, and so it even got to be kind of a tourist attraction where they'd stop and look at old Bohemia Sharp out there with his long johns. And there's one story that says, let's see, they got split in the back, so we turned them around. But was still walking around like that. But he was a hermit, yes, but he was a very smart man. Everybody said that. And he lived on mostly beans. He didn't kill the deer out there. And there's this great story. A fellow named Landros is staying on his property for a while, and Landros gets hungry, and he goes out. He's going to shoot a deer. He's just about to shoot the deer when he feels this rifle in his back, and Bohemia Sharp tells him that if he shoots the deer, he will shoot him. And he was a man you believe when he said something like that. So the man didn't shoot the deer. Maybe that's one of the things that liked Opal, but he was such a character, living as a hermit. And then when he was 80, he was sent to the county poor farm, which was out in Thurston at the time. He couldn't care for himself. They thought he was really poor. Now, after several years in the poor farm, he was committed to Oregon State Mental Hospital. Maybe because he wouldn't stop complaining that he wouldn't need to be in the poor farm if Lane County had ever paid him for the road in the first place. You see, that's in the connection. So yeah, complaining like that, send you on up to the mental hospital. He's got this delusion that the government owes him money. Lots of people in the mental hospital have that delusion. So, and here's a picture of him that Ivan Hoyer, that if you haven't seen or read through Ivan Hoyer's book called Bohemia Gold, it is wonderful. I was fortunate to know him. He did some research for me. And this is his chapter on Bohemia Sharp. It has a back photo there with, I don't know, it might be Long John's there, so I kind of like that. But because he built the first road or wagon road into the district, that he was really highly admired for that. He was a civil engineer, and that was not an easy mountain to get a road up. Now here is Gordon Grable's story of Bohemia Sharp that's in the volume 1 of Cottage Grove Gold Was the Past, 1970. And here he's called an early Bohemian. Now, Grable says that that Sharp died alone, like an irrespectable hermit would have it, and said here that he passes away. He's only spent 2 months in the mental hospital. He was buried in a potter's field without a single friend in attendance. So that's one thing I'm going to challenge. Where is his body? And Gordon Grable said he was buried in Potter's Field, but nobody attended his funeral. I'll show you why I know the Potter's Field isn't around Cottage Grove, because I make phone calls. Now here is Ray Nelson's wonderful books. Came out in '59, and he updated it in 1969 about Bohemia Sharp, the hermit there, and he's got some of the stories. Now here are the newspaper stories. Starting 1913, the Sentinel runs an article, says, "Old man sick and no one to care." And it really is heartbreaking. It talks about, it just talks about how old he is. He just can't take care of himself. And he's been such they call a colorful character for a long time. Now then the next week, Sharp case arouses sympathy. Hardly had the Sentinel been placed in the post office last week before readers began calling up about the case of Bohemia Sharp. People were concerned about him. They really, he had a good reputation, or at least a reputation. He was part of the community. People were concerned. So that causes me to question the Gordon Grable story that nobody attended his funeral. Because if it was anywhere around here, there would have been people attending his funeral. He knew people in Portland, knew people in Salem, but yeah. I've checked cemeteries up there, Pauper's Field, not there. He's not on the Oregon State Hospital grounds. There is an old cemetery there. I guarantee he's not there. He's not among those cremated remains. A historian up there is really good about searching through. We know what partly happened to his body. I'll get to that. Now, 1914. He sent, that first article was 1913 saying that he's really sick. Oh, by the way, something neat that happens in 1913, that should read 1913. Anyway, I'll correct that. Yeah, it should read 1913 instead of 1917. Friends of Sharp, he had a job as a janitor, and Friends of Sharp did his work for a while, and they gave him the money for it. So that also argues against, that nobody came to his funeral or cared enough. But here he is, they call him Quaint Bohemia Sharp, sent to the poorhouse in Thurston, and that's 1914. And then just a few months later, I've got these dates really wrong. He's that year old. He is taken to the asylum in Salem, and this is approximately what it would have looked like when Sharp was there. And two different documents, maybe they came from the same source, but say that Sharp just bitterly complained when he was sent to the poorhouse that he shouldn't be in there because Lane County owed him $1,500 for the building of the road to Bohemia. He had made a handshake agreement with the judge. It wasn't written down. The judge died. The incoming administration goes, thanks for the road, but there's no paperwork, so you lose. And that was to have such long-term implications in Bohemia Sharp's life. I think the road was done, somebody might correct me on the date, 1870, something like that. But he sent to the mental hospital, and November 24th, 1970, Bohemia Sharp is dead, age 84. And it was written up in the Oregonian and in the, of course, the Cottage Grove Sentinel. He died in the asylum up there. Neither article mentions anything about what happened to his body. Now, Sharp didn't have any family, and since he came up there from the poorhouse, in the records there would have been a real disconnect. He would have been seen as totally alone up there. And at the time, as I worked in mental health over a quarter century, and at the time, mental hospitals discouraged family and friends from visiting. Now, they said that was for their benefit, to help them get well. Today, we know that was so that they wouldn't get caught, because people visiting would see and hear horrible stories, and they, the institutions didn't want that. Anyway, Bohemia is dead, and but neither article mentions what happened to his body. Here is a copy of his death certificate, where it says, and it even gives the name of the funeral home, which fortunately is still in business. It says his body's taken to Portland. And I called the funeral home, and they have the record of having this death certificate. They don't have any record of what happened to his body once they brought it to Portland. Why on earth would you take Bohemia Sharp's body to Portland? There's really only one rational reason. It's not a friend, because he'd have a grave. Even paupers are in find a grave these days. So it wasn't a friend. Possibly he wanted this to happen, but he was crazy at this point. Anyway, he's in the mental hospital. I think his body was sold to the medical school for autopsies. That was frequently done with mental health and mental health folks in the institutions. It was frequently done out of Fairview with folks mentally retarded. So I think that's what happened. I can't exactly prove it. It's one of those, this is my gut hunch of what happened to the body, because his death certificate says he's taken to Portland. What are the destinations in Portland if there is no grave? That pretty well leaves the medical school. Right? They got paid for that. They got paid for those bodies. And yes.
Who's they that got paid?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oregon State Hospital
would have got paid.
Would have gotten paid for selling bodies to the medical, to Oregon State. Would have been Health Sciences then. It would have been. It would have. I can't remember. Can't think of what the medical school in Portland was done at the time, but that's where a lot of, that's where they did autopsies. They did some autopsies here too at the U of O.
And so there's no record from them having received payment for his body?
No. That would, and they probably wouldn't have kept one.
Yeah, thank you.
So what happens to him, but he's certainly not around here, because I've called around. I called cemeteries in Portland. He just disappears after he dies in the hospital. But why go to Portland? And if I can ever think of another reason, I'll let you know. But right now, that's in the absence of a grave for a friend, because friends did that for each other. I mean, I've got several stories where a group of guys got together and they bought a headstone for somebody that deserved one. This is a good quick time to throw this plug in. I did a more sort of abbreviated version of this talk at the Axe and Fiddle last month as part of the history pubs, and that was so much fun. If you haven't had a chance to hear history in an old historic building, it is a gas, especially when you can drink beer and wine too. Eat good food. But Lloyd showed the Morlock films there, the history pub. This was put together by the Main Street Committee and Jared Sedman, who will be leaving town soon. But keep a lookout for those, because Natasha at the library did Ava Davenport, and that's how I got sidetracked, because at the end of the Eva Davenport, and if you don't know who Ava was, she was a lady of the evening who died very tragically, maybe by ingesting strychnine, maybe by being beaten by a really well-known abusive husband. So it's this really heartbreaking story of abuse and a woman forced into an occupation. Anyway, at the end of it, we started talking about her grave. She's buried, Eva Davenport's buried in Fir Grove Cemetery, but there's no monument, there's no headstone out there. And so I would really like to see that. So if any of y'all want to chip in or help with that, well, that'd be